This video is brought to you by our new show, The Daily Briefing. That's the show where we run you through the 5 most important news stories each day, giving you a rundown of everything you need to know from around the world in a matter of minutes. Watch the separate TLDR Daily YouTube channel or subscribe by searching in your favourite podcast app. As you might have seen in the news, Sri Lanka is suffering through a bit of a crisis. The Sri Lankan economy wasn't in a great state going into the pandemic, but when tourism dried up and the economy was put on hold to stop the spread of the virus, it became pretty clear that Sri Lanka wasn't going to be able to pay its debts. As the Sri Lankan rupee collapsed and inflation picked up, Sri Lanka's economic crisis transformed into a political crisis, forcing the resignation of an entire cabinet and triggering widespread protests that have since resulted in the death of at least one protester at the hands of Sri Lanka's security forces. So in this video, we're going to explain the ongoing crisis, how it might end, and why Sri Lanka could be a sign of what's to come in other developing countries. As we said, it's important to remember that Sri Lanka's economy was always pretty vulnerable, even before the pandemic. There were a few reasons for this. First, Sri Lanka has a particularly rickety tax system. Tax revenues usually amount to about 13% of GDP, when you'd expect them to be more like 20%. Second, successive Sri Lankan governments have borrowed too much money. For the last 20 years or so, Sri Lanka has run a budget deficit averaging about 7%, which is significantly more than similar developing countries. These loans have often been used to pay for expensive vanity projects, like the infamous international port, which was financed with Chinese loans, and when Sri Lanka was unable to pay back the loans, it was ultimately handed over to a Chinese conglomerate with a 99-year lease. Now, to be fair to the Sri Lankan government, this policy has its merits. The increased fiscal stimulus contributed to Sri Lanka's impressive growth over the last few years. Sri Lanka's GDP per capita has accelerated past that of its neighbours, averaging an annual growth of nearly 5% pre-pandemic. Nonetheless, despite impressive growth, Sri Lanka's economy was still vulnerable because of its reliance on imports. As an island nation, Sri Lanka needs to import a lot of fuel, food and medicine, which is why it runs a current account deficit averaging about 4% of GDP. You get the idea. Sri Lanka imports a lot of stuff and borrows a lot of money to pay for it, and without a significant tax system to support it, their economy is always vulnerable to some sort of economic slowdown. As soon as the loans dried up, Sri Lanka struggled to pay for its imports. Sri Lanka's economic woes haven't really been helped by their political class. The governing coalition from 2015 until 2019 didn't really get anything done, largely because the two main parties only really agreed on their mutual opposition to the Rajapaksa family, who dominated Sri Lankan politics for most of the 21st century. The Rajapaksa family is headed by 3 brothers, Mahinda, Gotabaya and Basil. Mahinda was president from 2005 until 2015 and is currently Prime Minister. Gotabaya was Defence Minister from 2005 until 2015 and is currently President. And Basil, who's currently considered the brains behind the family, was Finance Minister from 2010 until 2015, before being charged with corruption in 2016. Anyway, the coalition opposed to the family, who took power in 2015, didn't get much done. This led to the Rajapaksas promptly retaking power in 2019 when Gotabaya won the presidential election and immediately called for parliamentary elections, where the Sri Lankan People's Front won a 145-seat supermajority, making Mahinda Prime Minister. Unfortunately for Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksas have proved incapable of sorting out Sri Lanka's economic woes. After cutting taxes, lowering interest rates and ditching an IMF programme agreed in 2016, Sri Lanka's budget deficit jumped from 5.3% in 2018 to 9.6% in 2019 and 11.1% in 2020. Spiralling government debts and the pandemic-induced collapse in the tourism sector meant that Sri Lanka was quickly running out of foreign currency, which it needed to prop up the rupee. Essentially, Sri Lanka's central bank was using its foreign currency to buy Sri Lankan rupees to protect the currency's value. It was doing this because, as we mentioned earlier, Sri Lanka is very reliant on imports. So, if the value of the rupee crashed, Sri Lanka would be unable to buy essential imports like fuel, food and medicines. With no new foreign currency coming in and a lot going out, a currency crisis was inevitable. By February 2022, Sri Lanka's foreign currency reserves had fallen to $700 million, nowhere near enough to pay off the $4 billion worth of offshore government debt due this year. On March the 7th, the central bank gave up protecting the rupee and allowed it to devalue by 15%. A few days later, they gave up completely, allowing it to float freely, and the currency devalued by another 15%. Today, the Sri Lankan rupee traded at about 330 to the dollar, up from 200 a few months ago. As you'd expect, when Sri Lanka's economy devalued, imports got more expensive and inflation spiked. Things weren't helped by the war in Ukraine, which was independently pushing up global commodity prices. Year-on-year inflation hit a 15-year high of 18.7% in March, driven by fuel and food, which were up 44% and 30.2% respectively. This is when Sri Lanka's economic crisis turned into a political crisis. In response to nationwide protests on April the 1st, the government declared a state of emergency and a ban on social media, only to revoke it 2 days later after protests continued. The entire cabinet, except Gotabaya and Mahinda, promptly resigned, and on April the 5th, a coalition partner withdrew their support, leaving Gota with a minority in parliament. On April the 8th, the central bank raised interest rates from 7.5% to 14.5%, and over the weekend, the new finance minister announced that the government would raise taxes and fuel prices while reducing spending and selling off unwieldy state-owned enterprises. On April the 12th, Sri Lanka announced it would stop servicing its foreign debt, the first sovereign debt default in Sri Lanka's independent history. On Tuesday, Sri Lanka's state-run oil and gas body raised the price of petrol by another 20%, having raised it by 44% in March, which triggered even more violent protests. After 15 hours of continuous protests, police in the town of Rabukkana used live rounds on protesters, killing 1 and injuring 14. So what happens next? Well, the protests will almost certainly continue, and you can understand why Sri Lankans are upset. At the time of writing, Sri Lanka is facing fuel, food and medicine shortages, with 10 to 13-hour rolling power cuts. The Rajapaksas, who have so far refused to step down, will probably have to agree to a new IMF bailout, just a few years after ditching Sri Lanka's previous IMF programme. The UN has suggested that in the meantime, Sri Lanka could implement a debt for nature scheme, where Sri Lanka borrows money in exchange for agreeing to conservation and sustainability programmes. All in all, things are getting pretty desperate for Sri Lanka. A debt for nature scheme is obviously not a substitute for access to international capital markets, and any IMF bailout will come with uncomfortable austerity conditions. As a final thing, Sri Lanka is far from the only developing country suffering from an unsustainable debt burden. With rising inflation and tightening interest rates, lots of poorer countries are already struggling. The current solution, which basically involves IMF-imposed austerity, is probably insufficient. If the world wants to keep economies of the developing world going, it might have to get a bit more creative about it. If you want to be updated on this story, like how everything plays out for Sri Lanka, then be sure to check out the Daily Briefing. That's our new show where we explain 5 news stories every single day. We pick the big stories, the ones you need to know, as well as some smaller ones that you might otherwise miss. So if you want to be better informed about the world around you and news all around the world, you really ought to subscribe. And it's only a few minutes each day, so what do you have to lose? We post a video version every weekday over on the TLDR Daily channel, so subscribe there, or you can listen along to the podcast by searching for TLDR Daily Briefing in your favourite podcast app. Thank you for your support, and I hope you enjoy the new show.